Our keynote address, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague and friend, Professor David Campbell. Dave comes to us from the University of Notre Dame, go Irish, where he is the Packey J.D. Professor of American Democracy. He's also chair of the political science there, chair of the Department of Political Science at Notre Dame. His research has been recognized widely. That I left my show and tell right there, but his book, American Grace, How Religion Unites and Divides Us, won all kinds of awards with co-author Robert Putnam, and is really seen as a benchmark and a landmark in helping us understand the way that religion operates in American society. He's finishing up a book on secularism with a couple of colleagues, which I think will also be tremendously insightful. He also, a couple of years ago, published a book on Mormonism and politics called Seeking the Promised Land, which is, if you're interested in the subject, it's absolutely fascinating, both charting the history of the relationship of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to politics, but also contemporary political engagement and political behaviors of members of the church, with a lot of interesting and surprising findings. So in any case, we're grateful to have Dave with us today, a leading scholar in the field, and look forward to his talk with lots of asterisks in the title, which those are the best kinds of talks. So please join me in welcoming Professor David Campbell.
Thank you. One of the first rules in both show business and politics is to keep expectations low. So I'm rather angry, frankly, at Patrick for not following that rule, but I appreciate the warm words. And let me actually echo what's been said already today about Patrick and his influence on this institution and on this program. It's incredible what has been built here. And it is phenomenal to see so many of you out here on a Saturday morning and afternoon to hear a bunch of pointy-headed intellectuals show you a bunch of charts and graphs. It's really quite impressive. And I also want to give kudos again to Jana and to Ben for the work that they've done on the survey that led to the book that we're, of course, all here to discuss and celebrate. And also just to note, in case folks in the audience were unaware of how the funding came about for the survey that was done, is really quite a remarkable thing, that Jana actually crowdsourced the funding and managed to raise enough money to do this survey from, as they say on PBS, viewers like you and like me. And really, this is kind of an exciting idea. Like, let's just crowdsource social science. And I don't mean that in a lighthearted way. I think that's actually a very intriguing model for studies that are of a targeted population that maybe are not the type that would necessarily generate a lot of interest from the sort of foundations that typically fund these sorts of things. So there's just all sorts of fascinating and exciting things going on here today. I want to start by telling a story that, as far as I know, is true. And even if it is not completely true, it has a certain truthiness to it that will help me make my point. This story was first told to me when I was an undergraduate at Brigham Young University by none other than the legendary Bud Scruggs, who is a real person. You might think I've made that name up, but Bud Scruggs taught for a time in the political science department at BYU. He had been active in politics, he had managed campaigns, and sort of came from that world and taught a course on how to run a political campaign. And in taking this class from him, he told this story. That back in 1992, George H.W. Bush spoke at the Marriott Center at BYU. Now, many in the audience might be familiar with that venue, but just in case you're not, it is enormous. It seats 25,000 people, which is far larger than your typical NBA or NHL arena. It is a massive stadium. Now, you might wonder, if you know anything about presidential politics, why would George H.W. Bush, running for re-election in 92, bother to make an appearance in Utah, which was pretty much a lock for any Republican? And the reason was his campaign wanted the footage of cheering people, a very, very large crowd cheering for him for campaign advertising purposes. So Bush spoke at BYU at the Marriott Center. Shocker, they filled the place. But this led to a dilemma on the part of BYU's administration, and by extension the church, because they didn't want to appear partisan. And therefore, they felt, well, if we've had George H.W. Bush speak in the Marriott Center, we need to have a Democrat speak in exactly the same venue. And so they contacted the Clinton campaign, and shockingly, Bill Clinton was not interested in speaking in Provo, Utah. Who would have guessed? And Hillary wasn't interested, and Al Gore wasn't interested, and Tipper Gore wasn't interested, and they went all the way down the food chain until they finally found a Democrat who would come and speak at BYU, and it was, are you ready? Drum roll, please. Cecil Andrus. Now, some in the audience are going to know who that is, but I'm guessing that some of you may not. And even in 1992, there would have been many people at BYU who maybe were not quite clear on who Cecil Andrus was, but he was former Secretary of the Interior in the Carter administration, and he had served as governor of Idaho. So the story goes that the administration of BYU wanted to invite Cecil Andrus, who, by the way, was also LDS, to come and speak, and have him speak in the Marriott Center, because after all, that would be bipartisan, right? That's where President Bush spoke. Obviously, that's where we should have Cecil Andrus speak. Well, a few folks in the political science department at BYU got wind of this and said, whoa, that is not a good idea, because there is no possible way that we could get 25,000 people. You could lop off a couple of zeros from that, and this sentence would still hold true. There's no way we could get, 2,500 people, maybe even 250 people to hear Cecil Andrus. Putting him in the Marriott Center would be a disaster, because it would just look like he was speaking to an empty room. So the story goes that members of the BYU political science faculty intervened with the administration. They ended up changing the invitation to Brother Andrus, and instead invited him to campus, but not speak in the Marriott Center, but instead speak in the ballroom of the Wilkinson Student Center, which is a perfectly fine venue, but much, much smaller than the Marriott Center. So they maybe had a few hundred people at most there, which for a Democrat in 1992 in Provo, Utah, is still a pretty good turnout. That story has stuck with me for many years, because I think it actually illustrates what I want to talk about today. The overall arc of my talk. First, I want to talk about how members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, 11 long syllables, Mormons, the M word. I want to talk about how those people are perceived politically. I want to talk a little bit about why members of the LDS Church should care about how they are perceived politically. And then lastly, what might be done about it. And as you'll see, I will be picking up on a number of themes that have already been touched on today. So I want to start with a news flash, just in case you were not clear on this. Turns out many Americans think that Mormons are Republicans. So if you were to leave this talk right now, you would have thought that this guy flew all the way from Notre Dame to Southern California to tell you that many people out there in the country think that Mormons are Republicans. Well, they do. But let me just explain a little more of what that might mean by first of all showing you some evidence on just how in general Mormons are perceived by folks out there in America. What you're looking at are results from what is known as a feeling thermometer, which is about the cheesiest term that survey researchers have ever come up with, but I'm sort of stuck with it because that's what it's called. A feeling thermometer, even though it sounds like the kind of thing you'd use in therapy, is a question that's asked on a public opinion survey. It's asked about politicians, it could be asked about brands of toothpaste for that matter. It's asked about various racial and ethnic groups, and in work that I've done, we've asked it about religious groups. In this survey question, you are asked, if you are one of our respondents, to please rate whatever I'm about to describe to you on a scale of 0 to 100, 0 meaning you feel very cold toward whatever fills in the blank, 100 means you feel very warm toward whatever it is we're asking about, and 50 means you're right at the midpoint. This shows you the feeling thermometer score for Mormons, taking out Mormons themselves, because if I include the Mormons, they're a small group, of course, but turns out Mormons really like other Mormons. That's another talk that I could give, but it's just as a little side note. Mormons like Mormons more than blacks like blacks, more than Hispanics like Hispanics, more than Jews like Jews. It's just phenomenal. But that's not the point of my talk today. My point is how everybody else thinks about Mormons, which it turns out is not quite so warm. Now, you might be looking at that saying, well, that's not so bad. It's kind of, in the middle. Well, if I put almost any other group in the country on the slide, they'd be up here, except for atheists and Muslims who are down here. So if there are any Mormons in the audience, and I suspect there are, and you're worried about how you're perceived in the country, you should be saying to yourself, well, thank God for the atheists. But here we have how Mormons are perceived. Now, here's what I want you to note about this. Note that the line basically stays steady, and this is from a whole bunch of different surveys, and I won't go into all of them, but if you want to know in the Q&A, I can tell you where all these came from. But just trust me, this is legitimate data. And you can see that the line is basically flat. I actually wouldn't worry about that. That's just a little statistical blip. It's not even significant. And that's kind of amazing, right? That goes from 2006 all the way up to 2017. Think of all the things that happened in between. There was this guy who ran for president twice that maybe you've heard of, who was identified by his religious background. There was a certain Broadway play, Sister Wives, Big Love, all that happened during this period, and yet nothing seemed to change. Well, the story's a little more complicated than that, because while that shows us the average, when you break up Americans by whether they are Republicans, Democrats, or independents, you get a different story, which is that among, here are the Democrats, you see them going a little lower. Here are the independents, they're kind of in the middle, and here are the Republicans, they're going up. So while on average the line remained flat, what we actually see is yet one more example of political polarization in the country. That not all that long ago, just back in the mid-2000s, there really was no difference between Republicans and Democrats in how they viewed Mormons. Fast forward to today, and there's actually a pretty big difference. More evidence. In the book that Patrick mentioned in his introduction, Seeking the Promised Land, that I published a few years ago with Quinn Monson and John Green, we did a whole bunch of experiments, survey experiments. So if you're a participant in one of our studies, you're answering questions on a survey, and we describe various people or political candidates or all sorts of stuff to you, then ask you what your reaction is. And we randomize it so different people get different descriptions, and that enables us to compare how the changes we've made in whatever descriptions we're giving people is affecting their responses. And so we did a whole bunch of experiments to find out how people reacted to Mitt Romney's Mormonism. And what we found is that in 2008 it mattered a lot, but by the time we got to 2012 it didn't matter much at all. The evangelicals, who were the ones who really had a problem with his Mormonism in 2008. By the time they got to 2012, they said, well, he might be Mormon, but at least he's not Obama. And so it all sort of worked out. But we were curious, in addition to asking about Mitt Romney, a very high-profile presidential candidate, what happens if you identify a candidate as being Mormon, and that is the term we used on the survey back in those days. What happens if you identify a candidate who's not running for president? What if you say he's running for governor? That's this set of bars, or mayor. And what we found is when we ask people who are told about this candidate who's running for governor or mayor, some of whom are randomly selected to get a description where there's nothing said about his religion, another group get exactly the same description, but they're told that he's a Mormon. What we find is that among Republicans, there's this tiny, tiny little drop-off in support, but it's nowhere near the drop-off that you see among Democrats. Now, you could say, well, maybe that's just religious bigotry. You could also say, well, that's actually a pretty reasonable inference for a Democrat to make. These descriptions that we give people in these little experiments are pretty banal other than the religion. So you might say if this Democrat answering our questions is trying to figure out, well, is this somebody I would support? If the one piece of information they have is that he's Mormon, well, you might think they're probably inferring something about his political beliefs, and they probably would be right. But it's still more evidence of this idea that there's a political difference in how Mormons are perceived. And then this data is hot off the presses because it just came from a survey that I did last month. We used a pretty standard question where we asked people, again in a big national survey, do you think members of the following groups, and we gave them a list, evangelicals, Mormons, Catholics, and atheists, do you think that they're mainly Republicans? Are they mainly Democrats? Or are they a pretty even mix of both? So here we're asking not about candidates, but just your neighbors, just regular folk. Well, you can see that while more Americans identify evangelicals as being mainly Republicans, Mormons are next in line, and then the Catholics, and then shockingly, not too many Americans think that atheists are mainly Republicans. Although it's actually kind of amazing that 12% of Americans actually do think that atheists are mainly Republicans, but who knows? So further evidence, but in keeping with what you'll see as sort of the overall theme of my remarks, story is actually a little more complicated than that. Here's what happens when I show you the percentage who think that these groups are mainly Democrats. And again, you can see not many think that Mormons are mainly Democrats or that evangelicals are. Slightly more think that about Catholics. A lot more think that about atheists. But perhaps even more interesting is what happens when I show you the pretty even mix of both category. And here you can see that actually quite a few Americans, they don't really know where to put Mormons. Now, it's actually true of evangelicals and Catholics and atheists too, which actually just sort of shows you that for all of our talk about partisan stereotyping, a lot of Americans just don't pay enough attention to really know how to answer this question, and so they just pick the midpoint. They say a pretty even mix of both. Hopefully, I have now convinced you of what you already knew walking into this room, which is that most Americans think that Mormons are Republicans. But what I want you to think about as I continue to go through my slides is that this presentation is, and I really hope this metaphor works. I'm trying it out for the first time. I think this talk is like the new Marvel movie, Endgame. And here's why I say that. Because every single slide, every bit of data that I have shown you and will continue to show you actually has a long story behind it. So it's like each of the various Marvel superheroes. And what I've done is sort of selected amongst a bunch of things that I and others have done in order to tell a story today. But in the Q&A, I'm happy to go into more detail about the origin story of any one of these things that I'm showing you. So you can think of this slide as like, this is the Incredible Hulk of the story, or the Iron Man of the story. Now, some of you are sitting there and thinking, well, of course everybody thinks Mormons are Republicans. Mormons are Republicans. Everybody knows that. That's the way it's always been. It's the way it always will be. Well, if you know a little bit of history, that is not the case at all. What you're looking at here is a slide that shows you how Mormons, now in this case, it's specifically Utah Mormons for reasons that I could get into that basically have to do with back in the early part of the 20th century where you could find enough Mormons to actually say anything about them. But this is Utah Mormons versus the national popular vote. So what is the difference between those? And if you see a dot that is below 0, it means that the Mormons were more likely to vote for the Democratic candidate and if you see than the rest of the country. And if you see a dot above the line, they were more likely to vote for the Republican candidate. So back here at the time of Utah's statehood, you can see that actually Utah was very much a Democratic state. They went strongly for William Jennings Bryan in those days. And then over the course of the 20th century, you see this upward sloping line. But notice that, when you get to the midpoint of the century, Utah Mormons, they were trending Republican, but there were still actually a healthy number of Democrats found there, at least people voting for the Democrats. But as we move into the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, you hit this very high point until we get to 2016, And this, of course, is what came up when we were talking about Phil Zuckerman's comments on Mormons being Republicans. Yes, they're Republicans, but in 2016, they did not go heavily for Trump. Why? Because, as was noted, there was this other option. They could vote for another conservative guy who wasn't a Republican, even Evan McMullen, who also happened to be a member of the tribe. But this is itself kind of indicative of where I'm going to end in the talk. I just kind of want to keep this in mind, that while, yes, Mormons are Republican, they aren't necessarily in lockstep with every aspect of today's Republican Party, specifically our president. Now, why should Mormons, and specifically Republican Mormons, care about this? Well, let me explain. All throughout today's discussions, we've seen slides a lot like this one. This is my version of it, but you've seen variations from the get-go and all the way through the day. This is just showing you, going back to the 1970s, based on the General Social Survey, the percentage of all Americans who say either they have no religion, those are the nuns we've heard so much about, who say they never attend religious services, or who are either not believers in God, or they say, I'm not sure if I believe in a God, and I don't know whether there's any way to find out. And you can see, as we've been discussing, there's this upward sloping line, not so much for the non-belief, but certainly for not identifying and not attending. Now, the reason that I want to show you this is to note where the inflection point comes. Because if we were trying to explain what's going on here, we have to have an explanation that not only says this is why this is happening, but also tells us why this is happening when it is happening. So what happened in the late 1980s to early 1990s that led to the growth of the nuns? Well, there are all sorts of theories and hypotheses that circulate around, and I'm actually willing to endorse a lot of them. But I want to focus on one in particular because I'm a political scientist, and so I want to talk about the role that politics has played in this. And Jan has already mentioned this, and Ben's already mentioned it, and I think it's come up in a few other talks as well. That what was happening at that time, that we see the inflection point, was the rise of the religious right, which has led a number of social scientists, myself included, but hardly limited to myself, or even those who've spoken today, to conclude that there's something to the idea that the mixture of religion and conservative politics has driven many Americans away from religion. I'm not suggesting that the coincidence of the timing is definitive proof. It's not. That's actually just what sort of led to the thinking behind it. But there's been a ton of research done that has actually confirmed this basic idea. Rather than talk about all of that other stuff, I just want to show you one example. Again, this is hot off the presses. This is my own work. It was published on Thursday in the Washington Post, so that's how fresh this is. This is the sort of thing that drives people away from religion. And let me explain what you're looking at here. Back in the halcyon days of 2011, the Public Religion Research Institute did a poll of Americans in which they asked, do you believe that an elected official who commits an immoral act in their personal life can or cannot behave ethically in public life? And so this is those who are saying that if you are immoral in your private life, you cannot be publicly ethical. Some of you may remember a particular president in the 1990s where this was very much a matter of discussion. And back in 2011, we see that of all the religious groups we have data on, it was the evangelicals who said, oh, no, if you're privately immoral, obviously you cannot act publicly in an ethical way. Those two things are obviously connected. Fast forward to 2016, in the immediate wake of the Access Hollywood tapes release during the 2016 presidential campaign. And if you do not remember what was said on the Access Hollywood tape, I am not going to repeat it now. You can Google it, but maybe not here and not now. So the PRRI, the same organization, did the same poll, and they found this stunning change among white evangelicals. They went from 60% saying there was this connection between private immorality and public ethics to now only 20%. And there was a little bit of a drop-off among Catholics and kind of a flat line among those who have no religious affiliation. So that's 2016. Jeff Lame and a colleague of mine and I, we were wondering, well, what does it look like now? And so that's what the last data point shows, and you can see things have held steady among really all three groups, but I want to point especially to white evangelicals, the base of the Republican Party. We even went a little further, and we asked not just about any old politician, because the original question didn't tell you who you were supposed to be thinking about. We specifically primed people to think about either Bill Clinton or Donald Trump. And what do you find? Well, the difference between evangelicals who are told about Clinton versus those who are told about Trump is pretty wide. When they were reminded of the Bill Clinton days, they say, oh, yeah, there's this connection between private immorality and public ethics. But with Trump, not so much. You see a little bit of a change among Catholics, but nothing near what you find among evangelicals. It is exactly this sort of thing that many people, myself included, believe drives those who are on the political left and maybe even in the political center away from religion, because they look at this and they say, well, what is this about religion? It just looks like it's another form of politics, and it's not my politics, so I don't want to be a part of it. And why would they think that there is this mixture of religion and politics? And I probably don't really need to do this in this crowd because we're all aware of the religious right, but just as a little reminder, here's a picture that maybe has 1,000 words embedded in it. That's, in case you didn't catch that, that's Donald Trump with hands literally being laid on him. And then there's another one, and there's another one, and there's another one, and there's another one. This is a president who has been embraced by white evangelicals. More white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump than voted for George W. Bush, which is a pretty remarkable statistic. And of course, it's not even limited to Donald Trump. This is Mike DeWine, who was just recently inaugurated as the governor of Ohio. I love this picture. Governor DeWine has decided that rather than be sworn in on a single Bible, he would be sworn in on, I think it's 7 massive Bibles that he very chivalrously gave to his wife to carry. So this is the new arms race among politicians. How many Bibles can you be sworn in on? That's just one example. There's former governor of the great state of Indiana, and there's Ted Cruz, and there's Ben Carson, and there's Rick Perry, and I could go on and on. The point is that for many, many Americans, when they hear religion, what they think is this. And when they think this, they say to themselves, well, if that's what religion means, that's not for me. And so when Pew calls them up and says, what are you? They're thinking, well, I don't want to say I'm any kind of religion because that means I'm one of these folks and I'm not one of these. So I must be nothing in particular. Now, some of you are sitting in the audience right now and you're thinking, well, why is he talking about evangelicals? This is a conference on Mormons. And I didn't show you Mormons, and I did. And I didn't because for that survey that we did where we were asking people about private immorality, the overall sample size was too small to be able to say anything about Mormons. And so I don't really know what the reaction would be among Mormons. I have a suspicion, given the fact that Donald Trump did not do terribly well in Utah, but we don't really know. So I might actually say that really what I'm offering is a warning that the rest of the country looks at those kinds of results and the turnaround where it appears that politics is driving religion rather than the other way around and says religion's not for me. And if that's happening for evangelicals, and if it's happening for Catholics, it is probably happening for Mormons as well. But some of you are wondering, but wait a second. I thought the church doesn't get involved in politics, he says to people sitting in Southern California. I thought they only spoke on moral issues, not political issues. And there is some truth to that. You don't find political candidates appearing in sacrament meeting. That's true. Conference center is not used for political rallies. There is an attempt at bipartisanship. My point, however, is that's not enough. If the church, the LDS church, wants to be viewed as somehow separate from the culture wars that have led so many other people to view religion as wrapped up with conservative politics. So we know that there are regular letters from the first presidency that remind members of the church that principles compatible with the gospel may be found in the platforms of each of the various political parties. And I could point to various anecdotes that I'm sure are familiar to people in the room, where there's been this LDS leader or that LDS leader who occasionally says nice things about Democrats, and Democrats who are within Mormon ranks always say, well, what about Elder Faust? And what about Elder McConkie? Well, they're dead. And there's Marlon K. Jensen, right? An interview that Marlon K. Jensen gave over 20 years ago is still quoted as the one that we can say, look, there was a former general authority who said it's okay to be a Democrat and be a Mormon, right? My point is that because we live in politically polarized times, it is easy for rhetoric from the church to be construed in partisan terms, whether or not that is the intent. I don't need to actually worry about what the intent is of those using that rhetoric. I can simply point to what I think it's a fair assumption to make the reaction would be. So if the LDS church did not want to be viewed as marching in lockstep with the Republican Party, here's some things that church leaders might do. One would be to emphasize those issues within the church that are not aligned with the Republican Party. What if we had a proclamation on caring for the stranger that got as much attention as the proclamation on the family, rather than an anodyne statement that's sort of vague and middle of the road on immigration every once in a while? What if that became a high-profile thing? What if church leaders made an effort to avoid buzzwords that, rightly or wrongly, now have a partisan tinge, like religious liberty? It wasn't all that long ago when religious liberty was a completely bipartisan thing, but that has become a very loaded term. And I know some in the audience are saying, well, that's terrible, because we should all be in favor of religious liberty. And I am. And I believe that many of you, I'm sure, are as well. But it's come to have a particular meaning far divorced from, I think, the way it was originally used. That religious liberty has often, of course, become code for freedom to discriminate against those who live a different lifestyle. And some of you might say, well, but that isn't really fair, because it is, after all, about religious liberty. Why can't we just use that term? Well, there's anything we know about the LDS Church, it is very comfortable with being very selective about the language that it uses. And maybe it would be possible to speak about that issue in a way that didn't sound quite so aligned with one side of the political spectrum versus the other. But I will acknowledge that everything I have on this slide, as I've noted here, is in tension with the LDS leaders' desperate desire to be fully accepted in the mainstream. That they have thought, I think it is fair to say, that allying with white evangelicals and with Catholics on these issues would lead to greater acceptance. And that may or may not be true, but it certainly has this other potential effect of pushing people away, not just from religion in general, but from LDS ranks in particular. But I want to close not by talking about the leaders of the church, but instead to rank and file members of the church. Because I actually think this is an opportunity, the current political era that we're in, for members of the LDS church to actually demonstrate that rather than their politics driving their religion, that maybe their religion could actually drive their political views. What do I mean by that? Well, Donald Trump represents an opportunity for Republicans, maybe especially Mormon Republicans, to continue to speak out about what they see as troubling behavior and activity. If there's any time that the Constitution was hanging by a thread, isn't this it? And I have had many people around the country comment to me that it appears that many Mormons have become the conscience of the Republican Party. It was not lost on many people in the country that we've seen a few LDS politicians speak out against Donald Trump. And I think it's not lost on many in the country that Trump doesn't have a lot of support in Utah, or at least he didn't in 2016. The question, however, for Mormon Republicans is whether they are willing to be the conscience of their party. And whatever your political persuasion, whether you're a Democrat, Independent, Libertarian, Green Party, something in between, I would hope that we would all be rooting for this. Not because I'm taking a partisan stand, although I suppose some of you might think that I am. I'm really not. I'm just simply saying that if a religion wants to transcend the culture wars that we have in this country, wants to transcend the partisan polarization that we experience, there is no better time than to demonstrate that now. And perhaps the LDS community could be one member of that conservative coalition that stands apart from the rest and speaks, if I might use a word that's common within LDS circles, less common outside, used a little more, at least differently outside LDS circles, an opportunity for members of the LDS Church to speak prophetically when referring to our current political environment. And with that, I will close. Thank you very much. Do you want me to take questions? Does anyone have any questions? Well, I could give you a long list, but let me start with one where the church has already taken a position, and that would be on immigration. Right? We are living through a period where attitudes towards both legal and illegal immigration are becoming very heated and very tied up with people's partisan views. If we had more sincere Republicans who spoke out against this administration's policies regarding immigration, that would be an example of what I mean by speaking prophetically. That is a willingness to speak against your party because of your principles. Oh, I want to be clear. My point on that issue or on any others is not to get into the weeds on policy. And so I agree, yes, there definitely could be efforts made on immigration reform. My point is actually the rhetoric that is used. And I will stand here and say, if you have never been to one of these rallies or never watched one online, they're horrifying. They're horrifying to hear the vitriol that is directed against people who are coming into the United States, both legally and illegally. Trust me, I come from Indiana. I come from a Trump state. And it is frightening. And it is not the Republican Party of the not-so-distant past. This was not George W. Bush's Republican Party. I'm not even a Republican, and I'm saying that. So that's all I mean, is not that we need to agree. You know, I'm not actually saying the Republicans need to get in lockstep with the Democrats and what we got to do about immigration reform. That's a different matter. I just mean, if we had more people who spoke about the issue in a different way, I think that alone would be a significant step. Fair enough?
I don't know if you're the right person to ask, but are you aware of church leadership using information like we presented today or earlier? If so, how?
I would be surprised if the general authorities were not aware that many Americans think that Mormons are heavily Republican. I can say this, I have actually spoken to the Quorum of the 12. They have a regular meeting where they bring in people to come and speak to them. And this was a few years ago, so I didn't actually have all of this. this is being recorded, so I will choose my words very carefully. I will say that having been through that experience, it wasn't clear to me that the people I was speaking to were terribly interested in the nuances of the data that I was presenting. Is that fair enough? They're the most Republican group in the country, even more so than white evangelicals, which we normally think of as the the base of the party. In a sense, they are because they're a larger group, but yeah, they're overwhelmingly Republican. Mm-hmm. Right, right. LGBTQ rights, far and away. I think that's. Well, in terms of an issue that would divide along a religious cleavage, it would be. I mean, those things you mentioned would matter too, but it'd be LGBTQ rights, which I didn't mention in my talk, but that would be another one that definitely, as Jana's work has shown, certainly led many people to say, well, maybe this isn't for me.
So we've been focusing mostly on the American experience, and you were talking here mostly about American higher exchange, but a lot of these issues play differently in global populations, right? So you could say there'd be a kind of strategy to say, well, like on LGBT issues, that maintaining a traditionalist line would actually help the church in Africa, in the Philippines, and certain places like that. And so it could be a wager to say, we'll stick with the church we've got in America, and in order to try and grow the church in the global South. And of course, that's a risky strategy too, based on what we've seen with the Methodists recently.
So I actually want to draw a careful distinction, and you can decide for yourself whether it's a distinction with a difference. But the distinction I would draw is between the actual doctrines and even policies of the church, and then whether or not those are communicated in a way that resonate with the political language that gets used. Okay. And I actually do think it is possible for the church to hold to what its principles would be without getting tied up with the partisan language. And not just the language, but also making an effort not to be seen as marching in lockstep with evangelicals and Catholics. Just as a little example, in South Bend, Indiana, where there's just an itty bitty tiny little LDS population, there was an effort by the local stake to hold an interfaith meeting that turned out to be just with Catholics. And the whole thing was framed in terms of religious liberty. And it was just, a colleague of mine spoke at it. I mean, he's like the most conservative guy you can imagine. And so he's all about the sort of partisan language that I'm describing here. And that was the church's attempt at interfaith outreach. Right? Now, it's not going to be the same everywhere. And I'm guessing here in Southern California, it's probably not quite that stark. But that's the sort of thing that I think puts the church on a path toward exactly what I'm describing here. One more? All right. You get the final word. Mm-hmm. Oh, I don't doubt that they have conversations about it. And I actually don't even doubt that the story that I told to start off with the George H.W. Bush and Cecil Andrews, that's a sincere effort. I mean, I really do think the church leaders do want to be seen as bipartisan. My point is, it is not enough to say, well, we'll have a Republican speak at BYU and a Democrat speak at BYU. We won't have candidates in the church houses, and we won't allow campaign signs on church property. We'll have the letters read out. Like, that's not enough, because that's actually not what is triggering the allergic reaction to religion in the country. It's this psychic connection that people make between religion and all this partisan stuff. And every time you hear partisan coded language from an LDS leader, whether they mean it or not, it's only reinforcing that allergic reaction, which in turn is driving people away, which is the sort of thing that Jana's book shows us. Patrick told me it's the last question, but we can talk afterwards. Thank you very much, everyone.